Hi everybody, welcome back to Charming Data. I hope you had a wonderful week. A couple of weeks ago, I posted this introduction to Dash tutorial, but I realized that I didn't really go into the callback. And the callback is the most important thing you need to know in Dash in order to create powerful interactive graphs. For example, here you see how the drop-down value changes, and it changes the graph component, in this case the pie chart, accordingly. This is only or can only be done via the callback. You cannot create any type of interactive dashboards without the callback decorator. So this is what we're going to do today. I'm going to focus on the callback and teach you all the things you need to know in order to create these powerful interactive dashboards with Dash. If reading some material also helps you, make sure to open this link below the video. I'm going to give you this URL and go into the basic callbacks. The basic Dash callback, a lot of this I'm going to talk about in this tutorial, so feel free to read if there's something you don't understand. And feel free also to go into the YouTube comments and just ask me any questions you have if my explanations were not very clear. Also, I'm going to create in the future, I'm going to create a tutorial on advanced callbacks and callback gotchas and client-side callback. Just make sure to subscribe to my channel, turn on your notifications, so every week you will get a notification of that video and just other videos that I create on Dash Plotly, so you can make interactive, powerful dashboards in Python. The data that we're going to use is data by Stefano Leone on Kaggle, and the source is financeyahoo.com. This had like 25,000 rows, but I made it smaller, truncated it to 3,000 rows. We're going to focus on the fund names, and we're going to focus on the year-to-date returns of specific fund names in order to create these this dashboard. Okay, so let's get into it. Make sure that if you want to skip to a certain section of the video, make sure to go into the video layout and just choose a section you want to go to or you want to see again. I would really recommend to wait or to see the end or the last part of the video of this tutorial, because here's where I go over the most important things you need to remember in order to master the callback. Make sure that you know these things, because this will make your life a lot easier when you build these powerful dashboards with Python. Okay, so let's go into the code. Make sure to import these libraries, because you need these libraries to work with this Dash app. If you don't have them, just pip install Plotly and just pip install Dash, and within 4 minutes you will have these libraries that you can import. And then we're going to read this CSV document of mutual funds into a pandas data frame. We're just going to create a list color that we're going to use later below. Start your app, and then go into the app layout. Okay, I'm not going to go over every single property in here, because there's in the Dash introduction and many other videos I go over the properties, but we can just see that we have the first component is going to be the dropdown, which refers to the dropdown up here, and then we have the button right here, and then we have another co-component graph, which is going to be populated with a pie chart, and then we have the div below, and then we have the radio item right here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components inside our layout. Most important thing is to remember the ID. We're going to use the IDs to connect everything inside the callback, okay? So always have an ID for your components. Okay, and then we're going to have two sets of callback. We're going to have this callback, and we're going to have this callback. This is just for tutorial purposes. They are mutually exclusive, so you can't have both of them. First, we're going to go over this, which refers to, we're going to learn about the single input, we're going to learn about the single output, the state, how to prevent the callback from triggering, and prevent an update. And in the second callback, we're going to learn about the multiple input, multiple output, and Dash no update. Okay, so just let's do one at a time. All right. So let's do this. I'm really excited about teaching you about the callback, because I practice this a lot, and it's not easy to simplify this, but I hope I'll be able to teach you this so you can create these strong dashboards. Again, if you have any questions, please, under the YouTube video, just go into the comments and ask me any question you have. Okay. The most important thing to remember is every callback needs an output and an input. You can have callbacks without state, but you need an output and an input for every callback. Every callback has the output, input, and state. They have a component ID, and they're also comprised of a component property. So they always have these two things, ID and property. The component ID will tell the app what component you're referring to inside the layout. So in this case, my dropdown is a component ID of, you guessed it, my dropdown. So now I'm telling the app, think of or look into this dropdown, and the property I'm gonna use is a value. So if you go into the dropdown, you'll see Dash documentation has information about the dropdown, but here in PyCharm, if you also hover on this, it will give you the different properties that the dropdown has. And in this case, the dropdown has several different properties. We're going to focus on the value property, okay? And as you can see here, the value property is a list of the fund's names, okay? So remember, it's a list of strings of the fund names. So we're going to take something, we're going to take this value, and we're going to use it in the function and do something with it in order to affect the output, okay? Something important to remember. Every callback, under the callback, you're going to have to define a function. You can call it whatever you want, but every function needs arguments. And the arguments have to refer to the inputs and the states. So if you have one input, you'll have one argument. If you have an input and a state, you'll have two arguments. Or two inputs, you'll have two arguments as well. And the arguments refer to the component property of the input or of the state. Okay, so this val chosen, just a name that I created, you can change this name to whatever you want, refers to the component property of the dropdown. In this case, the value. All right, so let's see what the value is. The value is a list of fund names. So this is the same thing of saying this. This is exactly the same thing, okay? But we can't do this because we want to make it interactive. So it's not always going to be this fund names. It's just going to be whatever the user chooses. Okay, and now let's look into the function and see what happens and how it affects the output. Because that's the whole goal of the function, to do something with the input and state and do something with your data in order to impact the output. So we're going to say if the length of the val chosen is bigger than 0, and we know that the initial length is bigger than 0 because the initial length is 3 fund names, so it's a list of equal 3. Then do this, right? And what does this mean? We're going to print the value chosen. We're going to print the type. I always recommend printing these things because they help you understand what type you're looking into and what the value looks like. And then all I'm doing here is I'm going to filter the data frame so I only get the rows of the funds chosen, right? The list of those funds. So now I have probably only 3 rows because by default I only have 3 funds. And then I'm going to build the pie chart. Important to remember, the DFF, you have to make a copy of the data frame. Make a copy of the data frame. Never change or filter the data frame and update it. The original data frame that you have on top. If you have a DF on top, like that's your data frame, that's your global data frame. If you change it, you want to make a copy of it. There's a lot of different reasons of why you want to do that. I'm not going to go into it, but always inside the function, make a copy of your data frame if you're changing the data frame. You're building the pie chart, and then you're returning the figure. What does this mean? Whatever you return in the function, the callback function, returns the component property of the output. Okay, remember, whatever a function returns, the object the function returns the component property of the output. So in this case, the output ID is graph output, so we know that we are referring to the component, the graph component, and it's going to return an object into the figure property, right? So it's going to return an object into this. You don't need this. This is just for tutorial purposes, so you can see. But what I'm actually doing, if I'm returning a figure, this fig that was built, is exactly the same thing as saying figure equals fig. All right. Again, but you can't do this because you want your dashboard to be interactive, so you just have an empty dictionary. And it's a dictionary. You need to know what you are returning. You need to know what the property type is. In this case, the property type is dictionary because figure is a dictionary in the graph component. So you have to return, whatever you return has to be in the form of a dictionary. If you return a list, it won't work. Okay. Some properties are lists. For example, look at the div here. We'll see below that the children of the div is a list. So if you, for example, return an output to the children component property of the div, you have to return an object that is a class type list. All right. Okay. So I'm returning the figure here, and this figure is a dictionary, which is actually the pie chart. So now every time I update the dropdown, let's take out one property, it actually triggers the callback. And now you can see down here below, because I'm printing, the values chosen was fidelity and 500 and fidelity advisor. We only have those two. And the list here, the type is a list. I'm creating this pie chart, I'm updating it, and then I'm returning it into the output of the graph, which is why you're returning 2. If I do only 1, then it returns only 1. Okay. Input triggers whenever the component property of the input changes, it triggers the callback. Okay, remember this, whenever the component property of the input changes, it triggers the callback. So that's why the button here doesn't mean anything because I don't put it in this callback, but every time I change the component property of the dropdown, I'm triggering the callback. Okay, so we went over the single input, the single output. Now let's look at state. What is state? Let's do this. Hashtag this out. Hashtag these back in. Let's add n here. And let's print this. Okay, so what did I do here? What do we have right now? Right now we have the same output, the figure of the component property, but now we have an input and a state. So because we have 2, we need 2 arguments inside the function, and it's by order. So the first argument refers to the first input, which is the n clicks, and the second argument refers to the dropdown. So we already did this. We already know what val chosen means because we did it 2 minutes ago with this. But what is the input here? This input n refers to the n clicks property, component property of the button. My button is the button ID right here. And n clicks equals 0. N clicks is just a property that counts the number of times the button was clicked. The first default is going to be 0. So this is the same thing as saying n clicks. We can just say 0. Again, you can't do this because you want it to be interactive. So you just say n clicks. So n is always going to refer to the number of times the button was clicked. And because whenever input changes, the callback is triggered. Whenever a button changes, the callback is triggered. The difference between input and state is that state does not trigger the callback. State can change. I can change the values of state of the dropdown because state is a dropdown, and it will not change the pie chart. You see, I'm changing the dropdowns, but it doesn't change the pie chart because it's only state, and state does not trigger the callback. To trigger the callback, I have to change the component property of the input, which is, in this case, my button. So if I change the clicks, and I'm going to click on it once, you'll see that it changed the pie chart because now, we'll go to the bottom, n equals 1. If I click on it again, n equals 2, and n equals 3, and so on and so on. So whenever the input changes, which in the case is the button, the pie chart changes. I'll take out some values. It doesn't matter. It doesn't update. I have to update only when the input changes when I click on the button. So usually state is used when there's like a lot of options that you want the user to choose before updating any graph, or maybe when you want to do like a form, when you want them to fill out their email address or credit card information, you need to put things in state so the callback is not triggered every time the user changes something. And so it's usually used with a button as well. Okay, but what happens if you don't want the output to update? What if you don't want the figure to update? So for example, you have these, and then the user just says, you know what, I don't want these, I want to clear everything out, right? And then update the graph trigger the callback by hitting the button. So right now you'll see that it didn't change anything, right? Why is that? Because we used PreventUpdate. And PreventUpdate is what you want to use in order to tell the app that the output should not be, the output property, the component property should not be updated. So the callback is triggered because the input did change, but the component property of the output did not update. So that's the difference. It's usually when you're dealing with graphs. If the user does something that triggers the callback, but you don't want the output to update, you always use the prevent update. So what am I doing here? I'm saying if the length of the values chosen, remember the values chosen in the dropdown is the list of the fund names. So if the list of the fund names is empty, the length is going to be 0. And if the length is 0, then I'm going to raise, not return, raise a dash exception dot prevent update. Okay, because you do not want the dashboard to the output to update, although the callback is triggered. So remember that the callback is triggered. Okay. So I hope that explains the call. Oh, one last thing, prevent initial call. Dash, the way Dash is built is that when you refresh a page like this, it will always trigger all the callbacks in your dashboard. All the callbacks are automatically triggered when you first load the app or when you refresh a page. If you do not want the callback to initially trigger, just change this to false, to true. So if you change this to true and you save it, now you will see that as soon as this reloads or refreshes, that it's not going to trigger the callback. Just refresh this. Oh, this, okay, let me explain. Okay, let me just reload because it didn't save. There we go. So now I saved it. So now you see it did not trigger the callback because I put initial callback true. Sometimes you would want to do this. Just know that you have this option. Okay, let's hashtag this out and let's learn about multiple inputs and multiple outputs. All right. When you have multiple outputs, you need to put them inside a list. You don't need to do that, probably should not do that when it's one output. But multiple outputs need these brackets because they need to be inside a list. And the inputs as well, if they're multiple, are also just like single, they have to be inside of a list. Okay, so we already know that we have multiple inputs. We need to have multiple arguments for each input. So in this input, we're going to have the radio item component, and we're going to have the property is going to be value. So the first argument of this function, color chosen, refers to the radio item value, which by default is radio item value. By default is black. So it's just going to be black when we load the page. And the second input refers to the drop-down value that we already saw. Initially is 3 mutual fund names. All right. So I'm going to take these two arguments, and I'm going to say, before that, I'm going to take these two arguments. I'm going to do something inside the function, and then I'm going to return. In a certain case, I'm going to return a figure. And I'm going to return something. And because I have two inputs, I have to return two objects, right? Because every object that you return in the function refers to the component property of the output. In this case, you don't always need to use component ID like this. You can just, you can just write it this way. This refers to the component ID and this refers to the component property. It's just a shortcut. So in this case, I have component property as the figure, and another component property is the style. So I need to return two things inside the function. Okay, remember this is very important. In the function, you have to return two things if you have two outputs, or you have to return 3 objects if you have 3 outputs. And by order, so the first one returns this one, and the second one is always going to refer to the second output property. Okay, so let's see what happens here. Here, I'm going to say if the length of the values chosen equals 0, meaning if the user cleared the dropdown, and there is no dropdown. Oh, let me save this. I forgot to save and reload it. So if the user cleared the dropdown and the list is empty, I'm going to say return dash no update. So return dash no update is going to say do not update the output. Okay, but do update the second object, which is the second figure, which is the style. All right, so let's see what happens here. Reload it. Initial callback is false, so it's gonna load a pie chart. And now if I do X, then it's not going to update the pie chart. You see, it's going to stay 3, but it is going to update the style. It is going to update the color. So this is blue, and this is red, and this is yellow. How am I doing this? The style, let's see the style of the sentence output. What is this style of sentence output? The sentence output here is the ID of the div, and the style is a dictionary. Again, you don't need this to put that in there, but I'm putting it so you can see. Remember, the style is a dictionary, and you have to remember what class type it is. So I have to return some kind of dictionary. And what I want to return is the color here. So as you probably know, a CSS dictionary, in style, you have to return something like this. So it's going to be color, and then the key is going to be color, and the value is going to be the color chosen. Remember, I'm not going to put this inside a string because this is already a string. The color chosen is already a string from here. Color chosen refers to color chosen, which refers to my radio item component, which refers to the value. And this value in the radio item is a string black. So you don't have to put it inside quotation marks to make it a string. It is already a string. So I'm going to say the color is going to be whatever the color was chosen. And that's going to update the style of the second output. But in the first output, I'm not going to update it. This is a difference between dash no update and dash prevent update. Dash no update allows you to partially to not update some of the outputs when you have multiple outputs. Prevent update, like we used here before, right here, just says raise prevent update, just don't update the output. It's usually used with one output. But if you have multiple outputs and you want to update some of them, then some of them you do updates, and the ones you don't, you just do dash no update. Okay? Now, we're going to say else if the value chosen, if there's something in the dropdown, again, like above, just filter the dropdown, create the pie chart, return the figure, which refers to the first output property right here, and return the style, which is a dictionary of color and the color chosen. So whenever I do this, and I'm changing the dropdown, I can see that it is returning the values of the dropdown, which was return a pie chart. Here I'm not using the button because I don't have button in the callback. And whenever I change the radio item, it's also returning the new style color of the radio item. And if I do X, then it does dash no update. Okay? Okay, so we went over a lot. Let's do a summary of everything that we just saw. Okay, so the first thing to remember is a callback automatically triggers when the app is loaded or when a browser is refreshed. So if you do not want dash to trigger all the callbacks inside your app, just do prevent initial callback true, and it will not trigger them when the page loads, which is right here. Let's do this. Okay, we'll do that later. Second thing, whenever the component property of the input changes, the callback is triggered. So if anything in the input changes, right here is the radio item, the callback will be triggered and try to update the output. But the callback is not triggered when the component property of the state changes. So here above, let's see what that means again as a refresher. Here above we use state. So we're saying whenever the component property of state changes, the callback is not triggered. Only when the component property of input changes. And this is very important to remember because you're going to use many times your dashboard with Excel sheet, with forms or with input fields that you don't want to update immediately. So you just put state if you don't want the callback to be triggered. 4, the callback always needs an input and output. You don't necessarily need a state, but every callback needs an input and an output, or multiple inputs or multiple outputs. Every state and input need to be represented as arguments. So if you have 3 inputs in one state, you need 4 arguments inside your callback function. The callback function returns data or objects to the component property of the output. So this right here is always, whatever it returns, always returns information to the component property of the output. If you have multiple outputs, you need multiple return objects. Always make a copy of the data frame. So if you're manipulating a data frame inside the callback function, always make a copy of it. Don't manipulate the original data frame that is outside of your layout right here. Any given output, this is important, I didn't go over this. Any given output pair, a component and property pair right here, a component ID and a component property. Every single pair of output can only have one callback. So you cannot use this in another callback. You can't have another callback down below or anywhere in your app that has the exact same output. You can have an output with component property graph output and component ID and component property of maybe mode bar or any other properties that the graph has, but you cannot use these same pairs in another callback output, only once. And if the user, this is the last thing that we already went over, if the user triggers the callback because they changed something in the input, but you don't want the output to update, then just raise prevent update. But if you have multiple outputs, and you only want some of the outputs to update and some not to update, make sure to use the -no update. So that's it. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you understand a lot better the callback and everything that can be done with the callback. If you like this tutorial, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe below and turn on your notifications so you can see future videos about the callback and about powerful interactive dashboards with Dash. Keep practicing, never give up, and always remember we are better together, so try and help others out as well. Thank you very much and have a good day.